So hi everyone, welcome back. I unfortunately had missed the last session because I had a prior commitment, but I did hear how interesting the session was, and also was able to see the recording. So let me start with. So I think again this week, Lakshmi and I think are splitting the summaries. Just for this week, so I'm just going to start off with the summary of the chapter, the fourth chapter of Muthulakshmi Reddy. So I decided to just go a slightly different route this time with chapter 4 and its summarizing. Because I did see that, of course, there's a lot of very specific information of, whether it was organizations, meetings, conferences that she attended, and so on and so forth. So instead of, going the route of sort of collecting and listing these very many things, I thought just finding a way to understand the essence of what the chapter was telling us, that could be useful. And also a few external references that, I found interesting that I could share with all of you. So of course, chapter 4 seems to be largely now giving us the entire spectrum of work when it came to women's issues that Muthulakshmi Reddy was involved in. And the one thing that struck me as the most important thing is, I think, the diversity of the kind of issues that she was, directly involved in, and, things that she was contributing, not in the fringe and not in the periphery, but pretty much from the mainstream. That hit me as something extremely impressive. And I think there is also a tonality of the author to stress on the fact that she still had a very, very busy life. She was at the middle of this very busy life as a doctor and, practicing privately, as well as managing a family which was, pretty large. So the general sort of takeaway, or the way I walked away from this chapter, was thinking like, oh my God, like this is what so many women even today, right, strive to try and achieve, saying how do you maintain this, balance. And the kind of things that she seems to have done, the author almost states it very matter-of-factly. Oh, she, became a member, she did this, she did that, she did that. But, I think it takes a moment to just pause and say, how impressive what all she was doing with her life was. So that was just sort of what I wanted to kind of put out as the main takeaways for me. And if there's anything else that, all of you have, please feel free to add on. For me, I think this chapter also gave us a sense, apart from her own work, of the sheer number of women from India, right, who were actually doing such pioneering work in this, what seems to be like a very small period of time, and a very active period of time for, women's place in society. So that was something that definitely struck me. It seemed like the organizations they were talking about, and the most salient of them being the Women's Indian Association, the clear recognition that these were not isolated women's issues, but that solving them or addressing them were so central to the growth of the nation, right? That was something I thought that was very, very important. And for all of these women who seemed mostly to be first generation women, to have had an education, to have, had careers of the nature that they did, and finding their voices represented in, legislative councils. The clarity of the vision was something that sort of really, popped out at me, because they were not trying to fix, small issues or temporary issues at all. they were already very much looking long term. So that was something that I took away. Of course, and like I mentioned, Muthulakshmi Reddy's work itself, and how that life is something that even today I think we would find it very, very hard to, match or parallel. And she seems to have done it with just, such ease and elan. I will not sort of go through with this. This is something that I just listed, for my own sake, and we'll probably do that on the blog later on. But two external, I want to go straight away to two external things that I found, which was interesting. I just looked up the Women's Indian Association, and it seems like there's still an active association in India today. I didn't look into very much as to what exactly is the nature of work that they do right now, but it is an active organization in Chennai. And on their website, which is here, they have, this old logo of the association, which I found very interesting. The choice of the logo with the, the old India map and the woman at the center of it, as well as I think, of course, this is a image that must have been put together much later, but essentially has Muthulakshmi Reddy. I don't know if my cursor is moving on. It's not moving on my screen, but Muthulakshmi Reddy is on the top right corner. It's of course a much older photograph of her and so many of her colleagues who were involved in the founding. Another very interesting thing that I found was this. There was one image of the cover of Stree Dharma, which sort of formed the vocal wing, right, of the Women's Indian Association. That's what the chapter tells us, and of which Muthulakshmi Reddy was the editor for very, very many years. So just found the cover of one of their old issues, the way it was printed. But more interesting that it can go away from change. Can you see anything different, or are you still seeing the image? But on the website, the one a very valuable resource I found was you can actually go and find the volumes of this Stree Dharma thing, actually downloadable PDF volumes. And I was just, I didn't them in detail, but I browsed through them and found, I think this was the 1928 or 1930 version, where there starts to be records of what they are, they're recording these, the tonality of the magazine seems to be like, so let me just scroll through this whole thing for okay, just like this. So they kind of to be, noting the recent activities that have been happening, discussions that have been had, successes that have been faced with, passing of bills or finding champions for different issues. That seems to be the tonality of the most part. They do have also, along with this, they seem to have articles that are written by different authors. So even in this one, you see there is like a poem, and there is like a art sustainability, so on. So there's like that component. But it also just seems to be a very interesting record of the propositions that they were making, these women's issues, and why. And particularly, I thought, so I haven't gone through all of these volumes that are available there in detail, but I just thought I'll share this as a possible resource for us to go and track a little bit more of a, year-to-year history and what was the case that they were really making, for it, right? Because I just found that as a very interesting resource. But and of course, I will we'll share the links like we always do. Yeah, and just a couple of other interesting takeaways for me were these two women. who have been mentioned. Who have been mentioned in some nephew of Sister Sharada, which the link of which I'm reading here, which is a very nice read from a modern perspective, recounting what was the kind of impact that she had in the society of, what is today Chennai. Of course, so many of these institutions that I mentioned, these educational institutions still continue to function, and they are educational institutions of quality. So that is very pertinent. And also just to note the trajectory of Nalla Muthu, who was a sister of Muthulakshmi Reddy, right? Who also seemed to have been interested in the cause of education from such an early on time. And it's not often that we see somebody who's responsible or triggers the idea for the formation of an institution, and later while they're still in school, and then later goes on to actually be the principal of that institution. So that was the last thing that I wanted to note. And that's about it. I have a few other notes, but I didn't really want to, spend time over here going through that. But if there's anything maybe that you would like to add from the perspective of this chapter, or we can, move on to Lakshmi's summary of the other book, the 2 chapters from there. Okay, Lakshmi, I'll hand it over to you, and maybe once you're done with the summary, we'll open it out as we always do.
Sure. I have access to share my screen.
Yes, I just gave you access.
Okay. So this chapter gave us a little bit of the history of legislation surrounding the Devadasi system. So it's had a long history of legislation that surrounded many aspects of their lives, including hereditary rights, control over property, adoption, and the promotion and status of these women within temples. That seems to have stretched from at least the early 18th century. In 1861, there was a foundation of the modern courts of Bombay, Kolkata, and Madras. And the courts considered Devadasis a distinct group governed by a unique customary law. And between 1862 to 69, the Madras High Court also recognizes this, but then starts to express disapproval surrounding the practice, lamenting on the fact that there was no law that abolished it. In 1881, there was a campaign launched by Vedasalingam, who we met in the earlier chapter on the ban of Nagaratama's book. And here he starts a campaign where he constitutes these women as prostitutes. On the side here is a little bit of text that also drew for me a little bit about gender balance, and also how the court viewed these cases during the time period. Sometimes it applied the IPC, the Indian Penal Code, and other times it took to customary law to deal with their rights. So in 1863, there's Vedasalingam's memorandum to Lord Wenlock, and he requests that the governor does not attend any events where dance is presented. He also receives support from Christian missionary groups who are appalled at the idea of European officers attending these sessions. And in 1909, the Mysore government stops availing the services of Devadasis. Delhi and the Madras government were told to engage due to the religious nature of these customs. In 1927, an American journalist writes a book by Catherine Mayo, and she writes a book called Mother India, which critiques several of the prevailing religious customs of the time. And this sparks a debate on the Devadasi system in the Central Legislative Assembly in Delhi. V. Ramadas Bungulu, who's a member of the council from Madras, he requests the governor to prevent minor girls from being dedicated. And he highlights the economics of the system and argues that the land be gifted to the Devadasis by the government. And he also recommends changes to the way the Religious Endowment Act functions. And he proposes that the loss of income that this community might suffer should be compensated by creating Hindu rescue homes. Another law member argues for the government to support minor children but not take action on the system as a whole. A third, G. Natation, who's a publisher and he's a non-official representative for the Madras government, he argues that this is best left to local governments to decide, and this is how the Legislative Council chooses to proceed. In 1926, the Madras Legislative Council had become the first legislature in India to include a woman. With the Delhi legislature outsourcing this debate to the Madras Council, Muthulakshmi Reddy takes up this cause to end the dedication of women. This gathers press attention, with many papers beginning to critique the practice. The Devadasi community itself creates a counter movement that contests these framings, and the government at this stage seems to be ambivalent and does not take a stance either way. So a select group of Devadasis here gather at Vinodanamal's house and elsewhere. Nagaratnam and Doreikanuamal, they play a leading role. They draw a petition and send it to the Madras Legislative Council on the 3rd of November, 1927. And this offers 9 sections as to why they think an abolishment should not be attempted. They protest with being clubbed as common prostitutes. And if they argue that if prostitution was a problem, then the government should concern itself with improving the morality of the public, not critique them. They agree that some members have gone astray, but this is not a reflection of the system as a whole. They recognize that the government hesitated to legislate against the system because of its religious nature, and they attempt to draw religious connections, arguing that they had hereditary rights granted to them by temples and by scripture. They also offer an economic argument they would be destitute if not for this support. And they request time to gather religious and legal support from authorities. They ask that the question be taken up again in the legislature in a year's time in 1928. There's a second appeal of the gender dynamic, and this section on the right for me, this excerpt, really highlighted the gender dynamic and the support for the resolution within this community. So it says here, the Madras High Court repeatedly laid down clear, unmistakable language that the dedication of one's life to worship and service in the temple has nothing to do with prostitution. Admitting that men in their community were all for the abolishment of the system, they felt this was mainly due to accepted political dictum that a man's interest gave basis to his judgment. The appeal ended with a request of the proposed bill of Dr. Muthulakshmi Amal be withdrawn for the present, like the sister resolution of the Honorable V. Ramadas Bandalu in the Council of the State. There's also an emphasis on religion and ancient customs and practices in their defense, as seen earlier in the excerpt below. So there's a handbill by Padmavati Amal of Tirunelveli and Ranganayaki Amal of Kornad at this point that claims, who claim to be Devadasis, and they're right in support of Muthulakshmi Reddy. And here they question the credentials of the Devadasi Association led by Vinodanamal Nagaratnam. And they demand to know how many members it has, how often it's met. They also claim that all the Devadasis of the Madras presidency were eagerly awaiting the legislation banning the pernicious practice and hoped and prayed that the members of the Legislative Council would stand united and pass the necessary laws. The speeches in support of the abolishment continue within the Legislative Council. The government expresses some sympathy, agrees to hear from the best brains in the country with social reform at its heart. And it agrees to tackle the difficulties and dangers inherent in the system. It holds that Devadasi was not originally meant for immoral purposes, but is unfortunately degraded. And it also holds at this stage that the government does not have an immediate remedy. The resolution is carried unanimously, and the Madras government takes the view that it holds responsibility to somehow address this issue. The Devadasis, in response, write the humble memorandum of the Devadasi of the Madras presidency, published not 1997, I think this was 19, I can check back on the date, but was believed to be largely drafted by Nagaratnama and it was sent to CP Ramaswamy Iyer. It receives a fair share of attention in local and vernacular press, and it offers very similar arguments to what was seen previously. It refuses to accept their position as prostitutes. It uses a Madras court judgment which held there was no relation between the Pottukattal ceremony and prostitution itself, highlights the differences between the Devadasi and the common prostitute, arguing that the purpose of the caste was religious service. It also compares the whole abolishment movement to the frenzy of the French Revolution or Russian innovators. And they argue that it is their right to live, follow the Devadasi lifestyle, and that this is protected in the Shastras. The passing of the legislation, they argue, again, and economically would plunge them into poverty, deprive them of an honorable source of living. And they ask for a gradual evolution. For the court and for the council to recognize out-of-wedlock arrangements based on previous judgments that the court has offered, upholding rights of children of the Devadasis to access their father's property. They also ask for time to gather public support and collect opinions and organize a referendum among their community. So meetings protesting the abolishment are held in temple towns all over the region. They all pass identical resolutions, we're told, drafted in all three languages and signed by the Devadasis. 8 Devadasis in Madras, including Nagaratnam, meet C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer. They submit another 6-page document that holds very similar arguments. Dr. Reddy here questions the religious sanction of the Devadasi system, asking why other temple towns haven't paid attention to these sacred books. She holds that 95% of the Devadasis lead lives of prostitution and 5% lives of concubinage. The Devadasi Prabodh Chandrodayam is a text that Nagaratnam wrote during this period that likely offered a view on how to restore the position of the Devadasi, or so the author speculates, although the text does not survive. And the text itself, the title of the text is based on a 12th century work by Krishna Mishra, which we're told is one of the earliest works in Sanskrit literature that attack the Devadasis. But after this point, the Devadasi Association begins to lose steam. The meetings continue, but there's a lack of agreement on how to proceed or where to go next. And a part of this complication arises from the fact that the men in this community support the abolishment. We're told that 2 women seek police protection at this time from the Nadaswaram artist T. and Raja Pillai, who threatens them with dire consequences if they protest against the abolishment. Nagaratnam here goes against this threat. She proudly identifies as a Devadasi, continues to attempt to bring younger generations of this community into working against the abolishment movement. During 1927, there's the All India Musical Conference, which is held in association with the Congress at the time. Dr. Rama Rao here acknowledges the role of the Devadasis in preserving music, but he attacks their morality. Nagaratnam performs at this conference and is the only woman to be awarded a medal here. But the names of the women are not mentioned in concert listings. About the 5 women who performed are left out. And the British Parliament begins to get involved and rejects the verdict that tradition couldn't be tampered with. Dr. Reddy proposes an amendment to the Religious Council Act in 1928, where she advocates to hand over temple land to Devadasis or offer a portion of the revenue, regardless of their service. And this bill passes in 1929. But the transfer of land takes time and in many cases is not fulfilled, throwing many in financial hardship. So perhaps Devadasis do not challenge this law, maybe because they feel that a court that has previously lamented the fact that there is no legislation to abolish the system would not take a favorable stance towards them. Other groups called the Santanis or Orthodox groups, they're also unhappy with the passing of the bill. They view it as an interference with traditional customs. In the 1930s, Dr. Reddy goes on to introduce a further bill that prevents dedication in Hindu temples. But she resigns from her role in the council in solidarity with Gandhi during the Satyagraha movement, and the bill is temporarily shelved. In 1932, Raja Bobili features a Devadasi artist, Devadasi, and who's also Nagaratnam's student, in a performance upon being elected the leader of the Justice Party. Other prominent figures at this time in Madras also do continue to feature performances occasionally, and performance seems to have moved away from temple context into more Sloan style performances. This invokes critique from Muthulakshmi Reddy and also leads to the creation of a pro-arts lobby, which argued the dance could be saved if separated from its social system. Between 1931 and 32, E. Krishna Iyer organizes performances by women from this community within the Music Academy. And there's the ongoing debate between Krishna Iyer and Muthulakshmi Reddy seems to spur public interest in the dance form. In 1932, Nagaratnam also embarks on a career in recording with the Madras radio. In chapter 8, we largely focuses on Nagaratnam's relationship with Tyagaraja and her activities in Tiruvayadu. Her life increasingly begins to center around Tiruvayadu. She performs, organizes fundraisers for her Aradhana there. And we're told that in doing so, she maintains strong relationships with a whole variety of stakeholders, from the police to shopkeepers to local government. There are 3 ceremonies now for Tyagaraja that is being conducted. First at 4:30 a.m. by Nagaratnam, followed by the Periyakachi, and then the Chinnakachi. And Nagaratnam's Aradhana draws a large and discerning audience, we're told, often from far-flung places. Another interesting complication that this chapter raises in terms of just the feminist angles and the role of women that we see in relation to both chapters is Nagaratnam's own debate in Muthulakshmi, a Telugu magazine, where she argues that domestic women don't need liberation or autonomy. She also argues against the selfishness of the perceived selfishness of Indian men as iterated by another author within this magazine. In 1930s, the Nadaswaram artists break away to create their own Kachi, and the Periyakachi weakens financially despite Govindaswamy Pillai's efforts. His failing health also offers another blow to this. Chinnakachi performances continue as usual under Vaidyanatha Bhagavatar, and this dampens the expectations of any reconciliation between the 3 factions. Kachi is also noted for maintaining a caste-based hierarchy. Now, the Swaram artists are not allowed to perform in the ceremony itself, and this leads to dissatisfaction amongst them. Between 33 and 35, Nagaratnam continues to acquire land surrounding the Samadhi, and she continues to develop the memorial, often selling her jewelry to do so. In 35, she also funds another biography of Tyagaraja, and she goes great lengths to perform the annual rites for Tyagaraja, which until then had only been performed by Brahmin men. She works around this in a number of ways so that she could finish and hold the full Aradhana. In 1938, the construction of the Samadhi is complete, and Nagaratnam, upon the death of Veenadanammal, she decides to move permanently to Tiruvayadu and dedicate her life to the saints there. She continues to hold concerts here, and she also continues to host the Aradhana. So that was what I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Lakshmi. Open to thoughts, observations. Mitra, is there something you'd like to? Yeah, please go ahead.
Well, I think one thing that just like as a broad observation is that you can see as the British move in, there's like you can see with these 2 books and even just within Nagaratnama, there's 2 separate reactions to the same thing, right? So one solution is with Muthulakshmi Reddy to kind of maybe conform a little bit more to those Western values, while there's a pushback with Nagaratnama, with Nagaratnama. So I think both want to create India and make India a more self-sufficient nation, but they have 2 different angles of approaching it, and and the people who come under fire for that are the Devadasis. So they kind of are at the center of this battle between, do we do we go forward with, and follow Western influence, or do we stick to our roots and just deciding which is the best path for India? So I think it's interesting that there's two separate, like, parallel paths here that they're trying to take.
Else?
So, when I first actually read the chapter from Muthulakshmi Reddy's book, and then it was all like, oh my God, how can like one woman do so many things? It was like very inspirational, and it was like I was looking up to her. Then when I came and read the first chapter of Bangalore Nagaratnama, it was like a contradiction. I was like, okay, her intention might not be right. I might not be wrong, but I don't think she saw the like what would actually happen to the Devdasi community after bringing in these rules. Like she was trying to like do the best for the women then, but then the problems that came with this legislation. So I don't think she saw that then. I mean, I don't know why I have like a soft corner for the Devdasis. But then that whole image sort of like changed a bit in my mind. So yeah, that's one thing that I wanted to mention.
Yeah, I resonate with that as well, Rajita, because I think the biggest dichotomy that I've always found in this argument, and is the fact that somehow there was a faction of Indian women who thought they need to fight for these Indian women and felt they didn't have a voice, even though they were always, very clearly putting out their opinion there. But it was almost like, we will think for you. We will. So
Yeah.
it's interesting, and like earlier I mentioned, there seems to be great clarity in the work that they set out to do on the whole, but
Yeah.
yet there are things that still slip through your fingers. It almost feels like one of those
Yeah.
I think a line from Muthulakshmi Reddy's chapter 4 reads in page 94. She believed the authentic vehicle of civilization was the consciousness of ordinary women who were beginning to value and demand the rights to make their own choices, organize their life, choose their occupations, and enjoy life without a sense of guilt. I think the Devadasis were kind of not allowed to make their own choice about how they wish to lead their lives. And at this, I had actually marked this line, and after the discussion, this thought popped up that, oh, she says, she supports this, but somewhere, there has been a clash in of clash of opinions. And also, I think the chapter 8, 7 and 8 in Nagaratnam Namal's story was very loaded. There were a lot of details that I like, when I just skimmed through, I couldn't directly understand. When we talk about the second appeal in the chapter 7, and there's something about a man's interest that gives basis to his judgment. I couldn't actually comprehend what that was about. If anybody has any idea about that, I would like to understand it better.
Can you share again the page number, Maitri? So it's easy to like.
In chapter 7, I think I marked this with the summary that Lakshmi had given today. I can look up the page number, just a minute.
Or maybe Lakshmi has has it on her slides.
Or I can reshare that quotation on the slide.
Yes, please.
Yes.
So I'm not sure if the way I understood it is correct, but because there are also, there are mentions throughout which talks about how it talks about the property laws and issues and things like that, right? So my understanding is that the men of the community were in favor of the abolition because they had something to gain, right? It was their own interest that was guiding that decision, because they, unlike the Devadasis themselves, who only stood to lose everything that they had, the men actually stood to gain, because both in terms of property transfer, in terms of now becoming the bosses, so to say, or whatever, the right, the people who led the family, the hierarchy basically shifted in favor of the men of the community, given that this was one of the very few known communities where the women made decisions or led the household. I don't know if I'm right in understanding that part that way.
I think this gave me a little more clarity. Thank you. And the whole while reading both these books, I I was confused on where do I stay about the abolition of the Devadasi. And I'm like, okay, if not for the abolition, all all everybody couldn't have gotten the opportunity to perform and dance as a public uh, art would not have been possible. But at the same time, we lost part of our culture and lineage. And so I don't know where I stand in between. And I don't know what Muthulakshmi Reddy had in mind when she received such strong opposition from her own community when she raised this issue. I don't think it's a Western idea. I think it was just a very original idea that she had, that this had to be abolished. And I wonder what triggered or what started the spark in her to come to a conclusion that the Devadasi community need not, be associated with the temple anymore.
No, absolutely. In fact, I mean, two things there. One is, I think I want to mention that this parallel reading has made me, in one sense, better informed, because I think my impression earlier, without necessarily having the, how do you say, evidence to support it, just the impression that I always had, and that's how you get to hear the story, in like popular whatever, in terms of how the story is told, is because she herself came from a Devadasi family and she had seen the difficulties that it involves. She sort of went the opposite direction and said, okay, this is not a system that should exist anymore. I mean, this is loosely how the story is told to us, right? But I really liked what, particularly this chapter 4 did, is also it kind of constantly gives you a sense of what's the world that she's seeing, right? And she is constantly faced as a doctor, as a medical practitioner, with young women who are either dying at childbirth, who have faced some kind of sexual violence, or are just simply too young to, be in that space. So I think it's really done that job of turning around the viewpoint of what was the lens through which she was viewing the world, and what may have led her to that space to say, this system, has to go. And of course, it's the art part of it was never, is never part of the purview at all over there. But from a social standpoint, right, what are the kind of, who's making decisions for you, what kind of agency or freedom do you have over your own sexuality, particularly if you're 12 and 13, right? I think so. It's beginning to give me a better perspective, or at least a starting point to see, how is she viewing the world, or what was the world that she was viewing, which, to be very honest, is not, they're very fair points of argument, right? But I mean, one could extend it and say that child marriage was prevalent across the board. It's not necessarily only a Devadasi thing. So it applied to all women in general, but then it's that two-edged sword, because if you're going to abolish this practice in general, then it's going to hit a particular community at its base. So I think it's done that for me, for sure. And I'll come back to it. I had something else, but I lost my train.
That's a point that I think that I was also like mildly thinking of, but I wasn't able to express it and put it into words. So that was a basically her perspective as a doctor is probably very influential in her thought process. I always tend to read these books with the East versus West perspective. So I wonder if I'm reading too much into it, or if this kind of, they don't really mention the British influence too much, but I feel like I always read these books with that kind of with those kind of glasses on this thing. So I wonder if I'm overemphasizing those things. I would like to hear your thoughts about, how much is this influenced by the like the colonial situation at the time, or is this more just a feminist issue? So yeah, that's a question that I
it remains a question for me also, Mitra. I definitely share that still, because once again, that's what you're given to think most often, right? Victorian moralities, and that's kind of influencing things. Of course, I mean, and there have been, other books or articles, when you read them, you do see that it has had a role to play, but particularly in the lives of these women and with Muthulakshmi Reddy, right? What was it? How much of it was an influence? That's a question that I share as well. If anyone else has a perspective on that.
I think Muthulakshmi Reddy attending all these worldwide conferences and hearing women's issue across the world, I think it also made her analyze what's different in India and what's common and what's different, and that could have made her that could have shaped her idea a little, I believe.
I think it's quite hard to actually draw that line and say this, this movement is inspired by Victorian morality or a particular way of, because everything from legal systems to social structures, it was all a period of transformation in every way. And there are lots of references also to an earlier period, maybe as early as 17th, 18th century, when there was increasing influence of the European court and of culture. So it was always through the development of the form, like even within the courts of Tanjavur, there was a degree of influence of Western, we could say, influence. So, I mean, I think it's just coming together of so many different factors that I'm not sure how much we can really separate out the strands and say it was this.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that separation is far more complex than, sometimes we care to apply, because and I think that's also what I wanted to say earlier, right? So even from the perspective of, so it's not, we of course are reading the lives of two women with, which is intertwined at this one particular, place for dancers, but we seem to have also moved away from hereditary systems essentially everywhere. Like even this idea of democracy, I think was a very, like, all of us will decide, right? All of us will choose what we want to do. It was a very new idea to Indian society at large. And the other thing, in addition to, these multiple changes, like Lakshmi, I think what you said is so relevant, because you're also talking about a time in India not long ago, like prior to the British, where religion was not looked at as different from governance. There was no and you clearly start hearing this language about how, the government didn't want to touch this, so the law didn't want to touch this, they kept people because, it was a religious matter, so to say. So that, I think even that separation was a very, very new way of thinking for us, right? And there's clearly pros and cons to that shift that happened, because it changed the way our education systems, it changed the way, I suppose even our yardsticks of success and accomplishment, it changed so much about us as a society, with enough pros and cons, I think. So it's also interesting to the one other thing that I was just pondering over is Maitri, like you said, right? She had all this exposure internationally. So was it that she was looking at women, of all sorts, and kind of making her baseline for what a woman's life should be? But on the other hand, at least the way the story is told about her, she seems to have been a very determined girl from a very young age, right? Very clear ideas of this is what I want, and even what is narrated about her marriage in the previous chapter, right? And her choice. I suppose it must have been very rare at that time in India for her to assert herself and say that I will not marry, which, for instance, gives me a hint that I don't think it was prevalent, practice in the West at that point of time for women to make that choice. Ultimately, somehow women's lives were tied into domesticity at some level or the other. And that was also the Victorian morality, right? This idea of uh, the good wife, or rather, like the noble wife, was actually the picture that they were painting of women. So somewhere, perhaps, I want to believe that maybe her influences or her mind was being shaped well before she had these exposures to, things outside of India. Because the dynamic in her marriage, for instance, already seems to be very, uh, very equal, which is what she was always looking for, and clearly very, how do you say, unique or rare for her time, perhaps. Yeah. I don't know if we can, we can reach out to or look at other sources to answer this question for us, right? Because the other thing I found interesting was also the sister Sharada's life, as someone who's widowed very early in her life, because that again seems to be a little bit of a ironical thing for me, right? Because it's the same parents who get her married that young, because that's the norm. But when she is widowed, say, okay, no, we're not going to let her live this life, right? Or live the life that is expected out of a widow. We're going to educate her and actually push her in a direction that is completely rare for again a young girl of her time. So it would be very interesting if we have any other if any of you have thoughts on any other historical sources at that time that would shed light on this. Where was this coming from, right? Because it clearly again seems to be a bunch of women who were beginning to have this access at this point of time, but what was the influence and where was this stemming from?
this also makes us think that even for the Devadasis, actually at their time, they had more autonomy over they had rights over property, and they could adopt children, which I think which says women, though they had their place in the society, they also had uh, power that is questioned a lot more in the recent times. I think they had that uh, during that time. Every uh, woman had that to some extent, and I think that's why even the Chandramal, fighting for herself. I think that's where every woman had some power that they had within themselves at that period of time, because the society to some extent supported this authority within themselves.
I think that the dynamic of agency that they had, and the degree of freedom that they had at that time is really interesting, because in so many ways they had privileged access to, but so many other women at the time were deprived of. But yet they also they still were living within a very patriarchal society, and they had constraints. We could see, like, there are earlier records of the Tanjore court, for instance, buying and selling women all the time. All the women still had freedom to, they had control over land that they were gifted. They were making an independent revenues. There's always that contradiction, that pull of power. And then I think that's also furthered by the role of men within this community, who took the secondary role as a very reluctantly. I think that just throws up so much. And I think that also within the debate of Muthulakshmi Reddy and the way she perceives this community, it plays a role, because it seems like they're selectively pulling arguments, at least that could be partially evidenced, and then choosing to kind of extrapolate that very general.
What's kind of Muthulakshmi, when she was fighting for these women's rights, instead of perhaps abolishing their community as a whole, if she was thinking more along the lines of, okay, let's see what can be done to make each woman, like each community better, while still maintaining their way of life, but so you can abolish, there's ways to abolish the bad practices that were occurring within the Devdasi community without erasing their entire community to begin with, that, like, erasing everything. So perhaps she saw this as more of a black and white view, saying that here's all bad things about community, so let's just erase this community as a whole, instead of trying to target the problems within this community. So that kind of comes with, are you really asking the women what they want in this community, what they want and how they would see their lives play out, rather than, okay, this is a prescription for all women and let's just get rid of this community. So I think she had the right general idea in mind, but was not executing it properly for all women. So
The other question in my mind is also, by this point of time, right, when talking late 1800s, early 1900s, what was also the distribution within the Devdasi community in terms of the lives that they led, right? Because it's absolutely clear that someone like Bangalore Nagaratnam was not an outlier, but there could not have been like 100 other like her. Clearly not, right? So she was quite a special occurrence in any community, let alone the Devdasi. But accounts of what, like real life accounts of what did Devadasi do, right? So they started
So that was just one account that came into mind. But
Any other thoughts or angles maybe that we haven't sort of considered so far?
I found it interesting the repeated rhetoric by both groups who kept emphasizing that religious connection to temples. And then even within the Devadasi like association and the arguments they made, they kept saying members of their group had degenerated or that they had gone astray and that the whole group should be reflected on based on this. That was interesting, and to me, I'm also led to believe by like the earlier accounts that we've seen that the dance in general was moving away from temples. Right at the time of Nagaratnam's birth, I think he mentions there that her mother was not earning very much from her temple performances and was seeking a private patron instead. So, what role did temples still play at that time? And I mean, it was interesting to see what actually financed this, because all the previous accounts of the sponsors we've had as well, there's very little accounts to temples itself. It's mostly private patrons, either royal families or other wealthy patrons elsewhere. So, and I guess it also draws attention to why they felt it was so important to abolish the movement within temples, and only temple dancing was targeted. Both in the 1909 bill in Mysore and also in Madras, where the practice of dedication is what is attacked. It's not actually later on dance itself elsewhere, but the initial focus seems to have been on temples, and I think that's interesting.
I wonder if the abolition of the Devadasi Act had any influence on the court dancers who were under the patronage of royal kings, because I think the question of being uh, misused by patrons would be applicable there as well. And what was their plight? We only read about the temple dancers, and I just wonder how this affected them.
My understanding of that is, by the time we're talking, the period that we're talking is about 1916 to 1947, right? By this point of time, the British had very systematically disempowered all princely states and sort of courts, so to say, in all across India, where they didn't, I mean, most of the prince and leaders was I don't know, some of you have seen it, perhaps. It's called Jalsa Ghar. It's a very, very beautiful movie which talks about this exact period of time where there is a, it's life of a zamindar who is used to living this life, being a patron, and enjoying the finer things in life. But at the time of transition, it's just that transition, and how uh, uh, life in India was changing, and this patronage was also changing. Yeah, so I suppose by the time they were really talking about the act, there were no more court uh, patronage that even existed. There wasn't any court patronage that existed.
That makes a lot more sense. Yes.
I think even though there were probably no formal like court systems that formally sponsored them, a lot of the mentions of the sponsors he repeats within this book. They come from their princely families, who are said to have individually sponsored events. And this is clearly viewed as a kind of a degeneration taken. So I'm just wondering how that perhaps relates to a previous period. And it's also prominent that temples at this point didn't pay very much and didn't really support a whole lot of the women's own. It was just interesting.
Yeah.
So I think going back to that, I think there's an account within Unfinished Gestures by Devesh Sineji where he looks at a much later period the lives of women outside of Madras and the way they continue to lead their lives in the 50s, 60s, and thereafter. So that was just one account that came into mind. But
Any other thoughts or angles maybe that we haven't sort of considered so far?
I found it interesting the repeated rhetoric by both groups who kept emphasizing that religious connection to temples. And then even within the Devadasi association and the arguments they made, they kept saying members of their group had degenerated or that they had gone astray and that the whole group should be reflected on based on this. That was interesting. And to me, I'm also led to believe by the earlier accounts that we've seen that the dance in general was moving away from temples. Right at the time of Nagaratnam's birth, I think he mentions there that her mother was not earning very much from her temple performances and was seeking a private patron instead. So, what role did temples still play at that time? And I mean, it was interesting to see what actually financed this, because all the previous accounts of the sponsors we've had as well, there's very little accounts to temples itself. It's mostly private patrons, either royal families or other wealthy patrons elsewhere. So, and I guess it also draws attention to why they felt it was so important to abolish the movement within temples, and only temple dancing was targeted. Both in the 1909 bill in Mysore and also in Madras, where the practice of dedication is what is attacked. It's not actually later on dance itself elsewhere, but the initial focus seems to have been on temples, and I think that's interesting.
I wonder if the abolition of the Devadasi the Devadasi Act had any influence on the court dancers who were under the patronage of royal kings, because I think the question of being uh, misused by patrons would be applicable there as well. And what was their plight? We only read about the temple dancers, and I just wonder how this affected them.
My understanding of that is, by the time we're talking, the period that we're talking is about 1916 to 1947, right? By this point of time, the British had very systematically disempowered all princely states and sort of courts, so to say, in all across India, where they didn't, most of the princes, zamindars were sort of converted into a state where they didn't have any personal powers to govern their own state, but they lived on, I can't get the word, some kind of a, like a monthly allowance of sorts that the British government, in fact, gave them. So I think long before this time, the the concept of court dancers was also very much gone almost. There's actually a very nice movie by Satyajit Ray. I don't know if some of you have seen it. Perhaps it's called Jalsa Ghar. It's a very, very beautiful movie which talks about this exact period of time where there is a, it's just the life of a zamindar who is used to living this life, being a patron and enjoying the finer things in life. But at the time of transition, it's just that transition and how uh, life in India was changing and this patronage was also changing. Yeah, so I suppose by the time they were really talking about the act, there were no more court patronage that even existed. There wasn't any court patronage that existed.
That makes a lot more sense. Yes.
I think even though there were probably no formal like court systems that sponsored like formally sponsored them, a lot of the mentions of the sponsors he repeats within this book. They come from their princely families who are said to have individually sponsored events and their own homes. So maybe even if it was not an official patronage, this seems to have been their most prominent source of revenue. Both princely families and wealthy private individuals who sponsor these performances, and this is clearly viewed as a kind of a degeneration in where this is taken. So I'm just wondering how that perhaps relates to a previous period. And it's also prominent that temples at this point didn't pay very much and didn't really support a whole lot of the women's own. It was just interesting.
Yeah, that's definitely always been a question in my head. I don't know, actually, if this is what you meant. Correct me if I'm going off on a tangent. But given that somehow we're always given to understand that the Devadasi service within the temple was somehow indispensable to the temple rituals, where were those voices? I've always wondered because the fear that seems to have existed on the opposite side of like, oh, this is a religious matter, maybe we shouldn't touch it. But you don't, apart from the Devadasis trying to fight their own battle, you actually find that the temple authorities sort of jump on the bandwagon and say, okay, let's be safe and let's dispense of their services, which I find actually very fascinating. How did they let go of something that was not, I mean, when at least given to understand it was not entertainment in the temple, right? It was a very essential part to the worship. How did they dispense of it so easily? Or what was the reason for that? It's definitely a question that I've had. Unless, of course, the answer, loops back to the fact that the moment you take the, the temple and governance center were pretty much, sitting one on top of the other earlier. But the moment you created the separation, you've again made that body powerless. So you've actually taken away the power from them to, to protest, or I don't know, but that's definitely a question I've always had.
I think that role is interesting. If they were such an integral part of the ritual, why were they so easily let go? And I guess the other argument there is that they probably started in courts, and then what happened in the temple was a reflection of what was happening in the courts. So when with the loss of patronage in courts, that also and they also saw in the lack of sponsorship for temples, that was weeded out. It's hard to separate. Also, I wonder if the focus on temples again, because also what she makes in this chapter, the mention that the government didn't want to touch anything religious, so the community saw this as a way of appealing to religion just to protect themselves. So this whole argument of we drawing this huge lineage of practice in temples came from that desire to protect them, to insulate them from these comments on their morality.
Lakshmi, do you mind repeating just that last bit of what you said about protecting them? Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
So in this chapter, he like within each of the appeals that they write, they keep drawing. He introduces this idea that the government was scared to touch anything that was construed as religious. They were afraid of stirring up religious controversy, and he says the community drew on this. And they tried to create for themselves a religious background, a religious history, saying we're integral to the part of our role in temples are integral. And that ought to be preserved. We can't be immoral because we're sanctioned by the Shastras to do what we do. And that, any contradictions to this, you're really just tampering with religious sentiments. So leave us be, in a sense. So I wonder if the whole role of seeing them as religious, as devotional servants of the temple, if that really comes about as a result of this argument, because they keep iterating this religious connection to a long history of dance in temples, rather than really them serving that role previously in temples.
Another like kind of similar thought is that if these since a lot of the upper class people had relations with a lot of these Devadasis, it's not really conceivable that they would stop their relations with them, right? It's almost just they will conceal their relations. Any kind of like, if you like, quote unquote, like prostitution work that they're doing, I think maybe they just didn't want the government to legalize these things. If these things will still continue like everything that's happening will continue happening, but just not sanctioned by the government. So I don't know if that's something that I don't know if this is a correct interpretation of the work, but it's like you can really see these things stopping. I don't think they're actually a lot of the, as in what I'm trying to say is a lot of the government officials that are saying this, are they really going to stop engaging in prostitution in these services themselves, or are they just making this argument so that the government is not seen as supporting it? So that's kind of a question that I had. Yeah, because all these women are engaging in this thing, but now they're able to profit off of it. But if they're not allowed to do this kind of work, then does it stop happening, or does it just become illegal is kind of the question, right?
Yeah, I think on that note, it's also interesting that they didn't actually go after prostitution itself or prostitution by any other groups. They went, their focus was on dance and on their dedication to temples. That was seen as the biggest point of contention. And we said that they continued the prostitution and their relationships continued to happen. The non-conjugal relationships that they led, that didn't really change after the abolishment that much.
Because this was probably the only community that could engage in this rightfully, because rightfully isn't, they could engage in this legally. So you're trying to just abolish the legal part of this while not actually stopping the act. So at the end of the day, you're just continuing to take advantage of the women and not allowing them to profit off of the work that they do.
Yeah, I think it's so important therefore to try and find more accounts, right? But all they exist of other lives of other Devadasis, sure, because in the previous chapters in the Bangalore book, it also talks about how she shared actually a very interesting cordial relationship with the wife of her patron, right? Narahari. So it's also it wasn't uncommon back then. Like I know this even from stories in my family about, like, for instance, my grandfather's generation, which is a pre-independence generation. It wasn't uncommon. Polygamy wasn't uncommon, and it was never protested within the social system or within the family, because I mean, it was just sort of how things function. So it's a particularly, what was it, because when the argument, I think, starts becoming that of morality, right, and that's probably when people also don't want to take sides, you don't want to be seen as doing something right, and there must have been a very severe change within a very small time in what was originally considered socially very normal, very regular, to something that gets framed as, this doesn't, I mean, like, if you come from a certain league of society, this just doesn't look good on you, because there must have been a shift within even the men who were the patrons of these women, right, to say, okay, this is not going to look good me doing, or I'm going to be judged by society. But it's interesting. Okay, so just to kind of, like, what I've put together where we are, I think it's really interesting, because where we stand right now is also just acknowledging the immense complexity of this history, right? Which for me personally has been a very interesting place to be in, because it's, taking sides is easy, right? Or saying, oh, this was right, that was wrong, it should have happened that way, is actually a much easier thing to do. But I think it's nice to stand it, especially today. I feel like so many questions have been raised to which we don't have answers, but there is a acknowledgement that there could have been so many parallel factors, right, in just the way society, politics, everything was evolving, that contributed to this particular instance in history. Is Yeah, I think it's a great place to be, undecided, right, and needing more information. But I also hope, what I might like to do from this, particularly today's discussion, is to just pull out all the the questions that we've raised in this habit document somewhere, so that the references, articles that may lead us in the direction of some answers, we can share that with each other. So I might do that for today. And if there's anything else you think, or any other sort of closing thoughts, I feel like we're in a good place. Closing thoughts? If just quickly go around the room, anything? Lakshmi, anything to share? Mitra? Maitri? All right. So I think that's probably a good place for us to bring this meeting to a close. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone, and see you next time.
Thank you. Bye.